Gotcha. I'll tell you what. I'm gonna wait for you. Yeah, they're kind of cheesy about that, my friend. I hate to say. So yeah, I think we're gonna figure out this live thing eventually. So I'm very excited. It is your friendly Kung Fu bus driver here in Boulder, Randall Davis. This is our third attempt, and it's fun to learn what all this technology is going to do for us. So I've mentioned before that my amazing co-host Owen Schilling is wildly busy, and um, our show Kung Fu Conversations is 100% either him and I talking to each other like coaches and trying to problem solve and problem shoot, or it will be us interviewing other people. But I had such a long list of people, and our show is pretty much booked out for years, that there were other people that I felt were going to be slipping through the cracks and I'd like to talk to sooner. No one's like, hey, we've got a bunch of platforms. Why don't you reach out to these folks on Instagram? Why don't you try talking to them through YouTube? And it'll be kind of like the show within the show. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. And if we get a chance, it actually should be another dabble into my Warriorship Conversing series. We're talking to a gentleman today that lives here in town as well, Mathew Apsokardu. I found Mathew from being on another podcast that we both have been on. Shout out to our good friend Brian Doucette of the Everyday Martial Artist, who is dropping a new podcast weekly. God bless him. And still trying not to pull out his hair if there's any left, and get out there in the world of podcasting. So thanks for Brian Doucette and his wonderful show, not only for having both Mathew and I on as guests, but for connecting us. He was another Coloradan. I kind of liked what Mathew was doing. Mathew has his own publishing company, as well as being a high-level black belt in Shorin-ryu. And he also does Kobudo, the Japanese Koryu arts, sword work. If it's from Japan or Okinawa, Mathew knows a lot about it. He's been over to Japan and Okinawa a lot for his travels and all kinds of different things. And so hopefully we're going to get him on in just a minute or two. We're both figuring out the whole YouTube thing. I finally found the room where you can add on a guest to do the live podcast. So we're going to try a podcast today with Mathew and get his perspective and his point of view on martial arts from Okinawa, martial arts from Japan. We actually had coffee before this. We went to our local Ozo. Shout out to Ozo Coffee. They do an amazing job, and it was so good to see them. And yeah, we sat there and talked for an hour and a half, and now we're going to talk for another good long while and get his background and what his goals are with his blog spot, with his martial arts training, and with his publishing company. So let's see how my friend Mathew is doing, and hopefully we can get him on here in just a second. So he's going to be switching on. So we were trying to go with his laptop, but the way a lot of these systems are, everybody wants it to be almost through the mobile exclusively, which is wild. But Mathew's over there working on the setup from the mobile, and hopefully everything works out okay there. We might ditch this one again. I've ditched 2 or 3 already, figuring it out. So this is all new technology. So thanks for bearing with us. And I'm glad I ditched some of the other ones because I kept doing the flip screen, and I have all my underwear and socks on the bed. So you guys don't want to see those before they're pre-folded and put away to where they need to be. So let's see what we can do to maybe get Mathew on here soon. questions. And where our friend Mathew Apsokardu? Oh my goodness! Hot dogs and hand grenades.
Hello, testing.
Yeah, fantastic. You
Can
sound
you
like
hear
a
me?
I can, sir. Sound like $1 million.
Well, I've had someone dial in this technology for me, so it's good to go.
Man, talk about learning as we go by the seat of our pants. I was just explaining. So I've already been on for 5 minutes or so, telling them a little bit about the day and telling them a little bit about yourself. And thanks for being a guest on the show. And I was telling everybody because I kept wanting to add you on by flipping the screen around, and I have all my dirty underwear and socks on the bed. Actually, they're not dirty. They're clean. They're on the bed so I can put them on my desk and fold them. And I didn't save any of that. I didn't save any of that exclusive footage. So,
I'm also glad that I came prepared. Clothing on. Nothing discriminating behind me. So yeah, we're all right.
We are all set. Sounds good. Well, Mathew, if you'd be so kind, I have a lot of Chinese martial arts practitioners on here, but I love all martial artists from all walks of life. Could you give us a little bit of a backstory in your training and your journey so far?
Sure, yeah, I'll give you the quick and dirty version of it, just because I know this can get a little belabored. So we'll get to the sizzly stuff as soon as possible. I started my training when I was about 11 years old. There was a style that just happened to be popular in my area called Okinawa Kempo. So, for those who may not have heard of it, it lives in the karate universe. It is a less, I would say, a non-dominant style from the island of Okinawa itself. You've probably heard of some of the big boys, the popular styles, Shorin-ryu and Goju and stuff like that. But this is a little bit of a smaller offset of it. It came by name around the time of Nakamura Shigeru Sensei. He was actually, this is one of the cute little things about the story of the style. So he was trying to bring everybody under one roof because karate was starting to get popular, was starting to move to mainland Japan. And so he was thinking to himself, well, if we all kind of collectively get together, then Okinawa can get its proper representation. And so his name for it was just Okinawa Kempo, which basically is just the fighting ways of Okinawa. And unfortunately, as often happens, the name didn't take. The entire karate universe didn't come underneath that one umbrella, shockingly. And so the name just stuck with his style. So it was one of those ironic things where it was like intended to remove styles, but then it just became a style.
Wow.
There's the origin story of that. But anyway, I started my training in that, and basically have continued that as my core art, and have continued to expose my experience to with different teachers and on Okinawa itself here in the United States. And I augment that training with a style called Shobayashi-ryu, which is led by a gentleman named Bill Hayes. Individuals who may have some experience in the karate universe will probably have heard of him, especially if they're on the East Coast. He's kind of a known quantity there. But I also augment that training with a bit of Japanese swordsmanship as well. So I am just a novice in the Japanese sword world, no ranking or anything like that. Just something that I participate in. So it really helps inform the application of my kobudo. And kobudo is the usage of traditional Okinawan weaponry. So the study of Japanese swordsmanship. There is a historic connection between Japan, China, and Okinawa. There was sort of like this three-way participation amongst other island nations in the area. So Japan has a large influence on kobudo, and their fighting arts in terms of swordsmanship has definitely informed that as well. So that's the quick of it.
Awesome. Now, somewhere in there, writing and publishing became your other art form, if you will. How did that happen? What was the bug that bit you to decide to not only? I mean, is that part of your degree that you took in college? And how did that happen, sir?
Yeah. So the writing and the martial arts kind of developed independently, but then eventually found themselves, magnetic poles kind of coming together. Not same poles, of course, but this right here, that's my writing degree, and then that right there is the book that I wrote.
Yes.
So basically, my academic pursuit, going from high school into college. When I first started, I had no clue. I think I'd be curious to know, your story in terms of finding your interests as well. But I think, like a lot of folks, my interest was unknown when I was going into college. So I
Yeah.
originally started off as a geosciences major, which is where that eventually came from. But early on, I realized that I was completely inadequate to handle the calculus and some of the chemistry that are required for a geosciences major. So I saw the writing on the wall. I saw the brick wall ahead of me, and I decided to pivot into something that I actually was more interested in, which was writing. So I had always had an interest for it. It was research, and both creative writing and nonfiction writing were things that I was always drawn to. I just was scared of the lack of career trajectory that comes along with something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
And by the way, that has proven to continue to be a challenge. So my fears were not unwarranted. But when I looked at the landscape, I was like, hey, let me try something that I think I have the capability to be good at, and something that I could potentially enjoy as well. So I pivoted over into getting a professional writing degree from Penn State University. Um,
Fantastic.
popped out of college, started getting jobs and stuff like that, and then I eventually realized that there was an opportunity for blogging. So I graduated in 2006 from college, and around 2008 is when I started up my first martial arts blog. So it took me 2 years to garner up the courage.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And it's Ikigawa? Is that still what it was originally called? Was Ikigawa?
Yeah, that's it. That was my original concept for it. I've kind of co-branded it at this point to Sanren Arts, just because the Sanren Arts umbrella is more encompassing to the things that I'm trying to do now. But the Ikigai way was the original concept. Basically, for those who follow Japanese philosophy, the concept of Ikigai is a really kind of complex and interesting and meaningful component of it. Basically, it's the idea of finding something that provides drive and purpose in your life, and being able to uh, form what you do around that drive and purpose. Just because many studies of longevity and quality of life, lifespan plus health span, one of the things that we keep discovering over and over again is the importance of purpose, the importance of community, and
Yes.
the importance of having sort of a goal oriented aspect to yourself. And Ikigai is just a really nice uh, concept that encompasses that. Talking about a concept called Ikigai, Ikigai. Uh, so I was thinking to myself, well, there's plenty of technical guides from people who are much more sophisticated than myself. What can I bring to the table? And so I try to bring a little bit of philosophy in with the technique and the research. So that's kind of how it was born.
I really like some of the interviews that you've done. For somebody that's doing more of a written style of interviewing process so far,
Mhm.
I find that you really capture whatever that person is talking about. I don't know if you're, just putting a transcript of what was said verbatim or you're taking out chunks. But I found some of the interviews and that you're doing very, very good. I also find that the little bits and tastes of philosophy, it's interesting because at least for the Chinese realm, I'm finding that some of the older podcasters, not older podcasters, but they've been around a while, are
Mhm.
going back to a blogspot template
Hmm.
to add on to the YouTube experience in and of itself.
Yeah.
One that I can think of, one of them that's going into the video side of it is a gentleman that has the falling leaves kung
Mhm.
fu.
Yeah.
And he's a friend of mine, but I can't think of his Ash Higgs. Ash is going from blogging to the YouTube, but he hasn't completely erased the blogging.
Mhm.
And my friend Byron Jacobs, he's been blogging for 4 or 5 years now, I feel like. And now he is slowly getting into the blogging. And I think that's wonderful because I really think that written word helps. And I
Mhm.
really think that a lot of people, hopefully, you being a writer might be able to talk about this, will take a little more time before they pull the trigger on releasing something.
Mhm.
Did you find that to be a part of your process when you were in the Blogspot space, or was it more free thought that you'd put down on the digital pen, if you will?
Yeah, you brought up a couple good points there. And I'm looking around for a place to jot down notes as we're talking because you've you've unearthed a few things in a row there. So process for writing, and also I would say, okay. So first, I'd like to start with a little bit of a hot take, if I may.
Please.
I think there's a sort of common wisdom that our attention spans are diminishing.
Yes.
And a lot of that has to do with technology and the availability of our and access for quick bites of information. And I do think there is something to be said for that because the way that we consume information is very quick. You look at Instagram and TikTok and things like that. It's sort of like, give me the hot, 20 seconds of it and move on to the next. However, I do believe that there's a counterpoint to that. And that is a lot of people are consuming extremely long form media. And so you look at podcasts, these can be 1, 2, 3 hours long, and people invest in the people talking. YouTube videos, documentaries. One that I personally watch a lot of is people that go hiking in interesting places, and I'll just watch them hike. Like
Yep.
they have some commentary, but like I'm watching them walk through Nepal or Patagonia or something like that. And this is an extreme example of how our attention spans are still capable of latching into long form content. It's
Mm,
just that the content creator has to be good and the
yes.
content has to be interesting. So
Yes.
I think the barrier of entry is higher to retain people's attention spans, which is not good news for someone who wants to create content but isn't very good at it. So my little hot take is it's not that our attention spans are dying. It's just that we do consume things in quick bites, but if you want to retain long attention spans, you just kind of have to have good chops. Um, and so parlaying that into sort of the next point, which is the blogging aspect, I think there really still is room for long form blog content, long articles, deep, in depth type of things. You just have to make sure that you've got an angle and make sure that you're talking about something that's somewhat unique. Um, Obviously, it's easy to AI spin an article out that's 1,000
Yeah.
words,
Yeah.
but that's not really going to grab anybody. So to kind of parlay that into your first question, so I feel like I'm backtracking into your first question,
That's all
um,
right.
which is my process for creating interviews on the written page. So one thing I learned is that if you just take a transcript and you put it down onto paper, it's not going to be very engaging.
Mhm.
So the way that we talk, the way that we banter back and forth, there's certain fillers, there's certain sort of cues that we use that when you look at it on the written paper, it's very bulky and very ugly. So there absolutely has to be an editorial step that you take the interview, you get the transcription, you look at it, you eliminate some of those conversational things, which counterintuitively allow it to read much smoother.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. I love that to death. Um, where is the blog spot going these days, my friend? Because I know I saw you put something up, I want to say last year,
Mhm.
and maybe even more soon than that. It looked like somebody passed away recently that you made a comment about.
Mhm.
Well, are you still going to keep it? Have you decided to rename it? Because it's funny. I was talking to my friends Greg and Sue over at Somerset Karate, and they're over in UK. And
Mhm.
it was funny because Greg was like, "Oh yeah, I know. That's a great blog spot," and a
Mhm.
lot of people are very familiar with your blog spot. So have you decided to rebrand it, or are you? I know you're keeping it under that new Sonren umbrella. By the way, what is
Mhm.
Sonren? You've talked about is Son 3? Am I wrong there? Because
It
I'm
can
used.
be.
It can be 3. So what are
Mhm.
you using it for? The Sonren label, my friend, and that how does that translate?
Sure. Well, just in case anyone who views this is accidentally interested in brand building and marketing, we'll touch upon that, but we won't
Cool.
deviate. We won't deviate too far from our martial landscape, so as not to bore the people that are interested in that. But So the thing that I noticed and learned over time was I was blogging under the Ikigai Way umbrella, and I realized that people really struggled to spell it and pronounce it. And it's kind of a weird clangy word off of the Western ear. So you say Ikigai, and it's like, what am I saying? Like it doesn't roll naturally off the Western tongue. So people kind of struggled with that. And so I found myself up against a little bit of a marketing problem where it was like, if I continue to try to build under this umbrella, I'm going to constantly be coming up against name issues.
Sure.
So there's a bit of marketing to that. However, it's also a hyper specific concept too. So it's was difficult to kind of branch out and broaden it without getting sort of in conflict with the core philosophical aspect of where I started it. So that was another reason for considering where I would go with it in the future in terms of my activity with it. So I blogged really consistently for about a decade.
Yes.
And when I started it, I felt like I had a lot of juice. I had a lot of energy. And of course, it's funny. It was a combination of sort of exuberance and interest, but also a little bit of naivety as well, because I had not been exposed to as wide a martial arts universe as I am now. And interestingly, the work on the blog helped expose me to that universe. So,
Sure.
um, so when I first started, I was like gung ho, ready to put content out, ready to put my thoughts out there, thinking that a lot of it was novel and interesting. And it turns out a slice of it was novel, but not as much as I thought. So over time, as I was gaining exposure to different people, I started to realize the limitations of my personal skill set and my experience. So I kind of like started to run out of that same enthusiasm to be pushing content out. And what I really wanted to do was go back into the lab and really think about what I was doing as a martial artist,
Mm.
where my material was, where my understanding was, where my philosophy was. While at the same time as the blog was kind of winding down a little bit because of that, I was also parlaying that into the writing of my first book. So the energy and sort of momentum needed to complete a book, all the energy that would have been going into the blog kind of pivoted over into the book creation process. And after the publishing of that first book, I got an opportunity to create a couple more books where I was either the ghostwriter or the editor or the publisher, not something with my name on it, but something where I was a factor in it. So the blog was kind of the victim of all those things. Now, my intention is to keep it live basically until there's a reason not to, just because as a database, I think there's some little tidbits in there that people can find useful for research purposes or what have you. Intend to keep it live, intend to contribute to it from time to time as I am sort of, if I feel an inspiration to do so. But really, the long term goal is to just roll it into the larger Sanrin process that I'm creating. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you want, but maybe we
A-
can, take
Absolutely.
little
Well,
bits and pieces.
how about this? Why don't we since the book was the big transition for the podcast, would you maybe zip over real quick and show us the book?
Oh,
And
physically see it?
yeah, let's see
Sure.
it and talk about it. Yeah.
Sure. One
So
second.
no problem. Do. I'll give the Jeopardy song for you, brother. I did a little bit of a do 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 do. We're back.
All right. Yeah. So luckily, I had them quickly available. Otherwise, you would have had to stall for longer. So yeah, here's the basics of it. Tales from the Western Generation. Basically, the concept is it's broken up into three components. You've got like the short first component, the chunky middle component, and then a short end component. The introductory component, the first component, is basically a discussion of how martial arts in general came into popularity in the United States. So this is a U.S. focused book. So for individuals who are outside of the U.S., maybe a little less interest, but still interesting individuals in here. How martial arts came to the United States. Karate specifically is sort of placed in the pantheon of uh, the different martial arts. So, for example, karate wasn't the first popular martial art in the United States. Judo,
Yep.
of course, Western boxing, of course, but then judo comes over, courtesy of Japan, and then courtesy of the increase in Chinese population, Chinese arts kind of have their day as well. A lot of it had to do with sort of the building of the transcontinental railroad, and just other sort of labor-intensive jobs that Chinese people were imported for. Um, Specifically related to the gold rush as well. Huge
Yes.
influx of Chinese population here. So you see a lot of that on the West Coast specifically. And to this day, California has an incredible community of both Chinese and Okinawan and Japanese martial arts. But then eventually, World War II-ish era, we start seeing an increase in the influence of karate. And then during the Vietnam era, we see a huge boost. And so that's where you get the real era of karate, which of course is sort of like the 60s, 70s into the 80s. So that's the introduction. The middle chunk is a bunch of interviews with interesting individuals who were a part of that process, bringing the karate over and helping popularize it. And then the end portion is just some philosophies and sort of like reflections. This is a little bit more of the subjective portion of the program where I interject my 3 cents into it, and sort of add some context to it. So yeah, that's the bulk of it.
Where can we find a copy of that book, Matthew?
Simple Amazon search will get you there. So if you
Awesome.
type in Tales from the Western Generation, you'll find it on Amazon. I also have a website, westernkarate.com, but that's sort of more the roundabout way. I'd say just go to Amazon.
Are you working on something new currently?
Yeah, I always try to keep myself engaged in working on something so as not to get too lazy and slacky. So my current project is the second volume of this. So the nice thing is that there was positive public response to it. We can also talk about some of the non-positive response. That's probably the juicier bit. But there's a positive public response and enough meat on the bone that I felt like there was more to be said here. And one cool thing was the relationships that I built with book number one here kind of parlayed themselves into getting to know more new people. And so the funny thing I realized, and I wonder, if your work on the podcast has led you to a similar realization, is the martial arts world has a lot more pockets than I ever suspected it did. I thought that the karate world was kind of like this chunk on the East Coast, this chunk on the West Coast, and that was about it. Not so. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, very much so. Some of the surprise places that people are not surprised about that are in the know, that I was a little less in the know, but Owen was in the know. There was a lot of knows there for me, was Canada. Canada has a huge population of high-level Chinese martial artists and practitioners.
Is there a historical connection for that?
I'm not sure. It's something that I'd have to look into, but I know that Ontario, Vancouver, you name it in Canada, there's some people up there. I will say the same thing. This might surprise you, is South America. In Mexico, there's a lot of Chinese Kung Fu down there. I'm not going to pick on anybody, but the Shaolin, the Wudon, and the Wushu are becoming very popular.
Yeah.
And I think that, with the push from China to kind of get that into the Olympics maybe someday, at least the Wushu, I think that that's something that's very appealing to people. Brazil has some high, as much as everyone thinks Brazil and BJJ, there's some really, really world-class Wing Chun, Chole Foot, and Xingyi and Bagua in Brazil. And so I just find it fascinating. And, maybe that's my own ignorance. Sometimes I forget how large China is. And then the other thing too, throw this, and this might be something that you could talk about, since you know a lot with the Japanese arts and history, is what time period are we talking about Chinese martial arts? Is this something that's like 800 or 900 years old that might be like a larger frame that has spiritual content that's infused within it? And people are looking at it solely as a fighting art, and maybe that's not what all of it was supposed to be. Are you looking at something from southern China in the early 1900s that a lot of the health-based practice was stripped away to get out there and kick some butt really quickly? You know what I mean? So it's a fascinating thing too, is not only what region, because China is enormous, and there's so many people in that country. Our friend Byron Jacobs says this a lot. These systems were not created in a vacuum. There's so many variables and moving pieces
Yeah.
that are moving around. So what time, what era was it created in? What was the purpose? There are some systems that are very, very, very specific. Wing Chun, it's a short range strike, middle range striking and kicking system. And it translates well over to our knives, and the long pole practice is very good, but it's very specific, so I find that to be also fascinating, as opposed to something like, a modern Hunga system, which might be trained classically, but you could have, 85 forms, and 97 different ways to do so many weapons, and that just becomes this huge monster to tackle. So I always, try to look at what region, what era, and then too, the culture. China, it's more like tribes, and a lot of people forget that. Is it a Muslim-based system? Is it a Hakka-based system? Those kind of things, and that piece of the culture will also be interwoven into those systems as well, which I find fascinating. So,
yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, which is like, if you're going to ask a big question, you have to start looking at the variables that are involved in answering that question.
Sure.
And I think Okinawa is a really excellent example of that, because you have such a tiny island, right? So now we're talking about a geographically very different scenario than what you described, which is the breadth and size of China. But you have this tiny island of Okinawa, and yet people are coming and going constantly from multiple nations, just always coming and going. And in fact, Okinawa for a long time is being used as like a tributary go-between between Japan and China, who had a political battle going on where they couldn't trade directly with each other. So there's this Okinawan go-between. So whenever you're trying to do research for Okinawan history, you try to get literal and linear of like, okay, this style's history is this style's history is this, or you try to find like a single point of confluence in the past, and it becomes just a mishmash, a soup, because you never know which individual was getting influence from these people and these from these people. You never know which people traveled versus just waiting for people to come to Okinawa, and you combine that with a very oral based history on Okinawa.
Yes.
They're not, not like record keepers the way that we see in Japan.
Yep.
Japan, very, very famously excellent record keeping for different family lineages and stuff like that. So now you've got an oral tradition for Okinawa, which means now you're subject to the whims of the storyteller. And by the way, culturally speaking, the Okinawans don't mind zhuzhing up the story a little bit if it feels appropriate. So the story can change depending on what time of day you're hearing the story and who's in the crowd. And then
so Chinese. That sounds so Chinese. That's so funny. That's so good. Keep going, my friend. Keep going.
No, and there's that cultural connection again, right? So like for a long time, Okinawa tributary status to China, so there's cross pollination there. But then you throw World War II into it, so now you've got a history of a people who don't emphasize record keeping, are more of an oral tradition, and now the entire island gets leveled basically. So any record keeping that was being done is now destroyed.
Gone. Wow.
So now, when we're trying to do actual research into Okinawan history, it is extremely difficult. Simple answers almost never tell the whole story, and we're constantly pulling from resources of like, we're actually going outside of Okinawa. We're looking at Japan shipping records or China tributary records.
Wow.
Trying to figure out, did Okinawan people visit these countries? How long did they stay? There's actually a gentleman, for anyone who may be interested in additional research on the Okinawan side of things. There's a gentleman named Motobu Naoki, who has done an excellent job of parsing a lot of this information well beyond what I would have been capable of doing. So if you're a research type, if you like the old diving into the nooks and crannies, he's someone I would look up.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. So you've talked a little bit of quite a bit about the blog to the book and the publishing, and you've got another book on the way, which I'm very excited for. And and you've talked about a little bit about your training background. How many years has it been since the publishing of that first book, Matthew?
Yeah, that one came out, I think, at the end of 2015. So it would
We're looking at
be
a decade, 9
we're getting
years.
close. Yeah, and I'll tell you, like, this is one of those little weird, like, perceptions of time because it feels like maybe 3 or 4 years ago that it came out. And but it's been like a decade since then, so, give or take. So I look back and I'm like, "Oh, man, I wasted a lot of time getting to this volume 2," but it doesn't feel like that on my end.
So that being said, you got to know so many people through the blog spot. You got to know so many people through the book. And you and I had coffee a few days ago. Maybe it was a few hours ago, because that's how time works for me. When you get your 40s, it just rushes that much faster. What has changed on your perspective on how you train and what you're looking for in your own practice? And what is your next steps of sharing your practice with others?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's something that a lot of us take time to reflect in, especially after you get through that initial excitement stage of your training. So I would qualify it, and this is a completely, arbitrary number. So I would say like the first 10 years or so when you're training, it's very excitement based because you're learning something new, you're developing interesting skills, you're going through the hierarchy of your system. So if we think about it in terms of like educational plateauing, when you first start, you're very much at zero. So any information you're getting, boom, you're hockey sticking up in that skill level. But
Mm,
but then after the first 10 years go by, you start to sort of level out because you've received that core information of whatever material it is, and then you start to say to yourself, well, like, what else is there for me to explore? Have I gotten everything I want to get? And a lot of this has to do with your teacher as well. Like, do they have a second phase, a third phase, a fourth phase of what they're teaching?
mm,
Or is it basically just like, okay, they received a curriculum, now they're giving you that curriculum, and after you sort of receive it, you're kind of on your own. So I would say what my focus has really been on is contemplating breadth versus width. Um, um, Excuse me, breadth versus depth. Let's
yes.
correct that.
Yep. Thank
Um,
you.
so what I've really tried to do is contemplate in the style of Okinawa Kempo. There's a lot of stuff. So we have a lot of empty hand kata. We have a lot of kobudo kata, the weapons kata. If you want, you can have up to 60 or so kata in your repertoire if you're so inclined to have it. So if you're a person that's really intrigued by different patterns and things like that, there's plenty for you to dine upon. But what I found was that while I was kind of accumulating those patterns, I was not really improving my depth of understanding of those patterns.
Mm,
So I would say what I've been doing, and this is I feel very fortunate because, like you mentioned, I've had an opportunity to meet interesting individuals, and get different perspectives, and connect with them, and sort of start to learn more about what I do, and sort of see it through their filter. I've been focusing more on the connective tissue that I think allows my particular style to operate. What core concepts or qualities in the body are universal? So
mm,
there are certain things that whatever style it is you happen to be practicing, if you can drill down to different qualities of the body, the ability to generate power, the ability to maintain balance, the ability to transmit balance, off balance to on balance, all these kinds of things, these are universal qualities that I think we all want to achieve regardless of the path that we take to get there. So I'm trying to focus more on that, how it's expressed in our system, um, and then see if I can maybe reprogram some of that stuff into the system and kind of improve my personal understanding of it. Because certainly, I think this is true of any systems. It's not style specific, but it's possible to understand it superficially, and it's possible to understand it with great depth. And it comes to each of us to decide where am I going to spend my time, and also am I willing to put out the energy to find avenues to explore the depth better. And way, this is no judgment on any particular teacher, either in your past, in my past, in the viewer's past. The teacher may be good, the teacher may be bad. The teacher may be good, but you can't receive their information because you're not ready. The teacher may be bad and you are ready. Or the way that the teacher teaches is simply not congruent with the way that you learn.
That's
So,
exactly right. Yeah.
we have all these individualistic natures in how we learn. So finding that ability to kind of connect with people who can help you dig deeper into what you do, and that's kind of where I find my study right now.
That's fantastic. What I like about that a lot too is something that I've been working on myself for a long time is that is a universal lens that is not Japanese, it's not Okinawan, it's not American, it's not Coloradan, it's not, it's not from that is a human perspective
Mhm.
or your lens on your electron microscope so you can see the DNA or you got the Hubble or what's our new one in space now? I can't think of it.
Yeah, the James Webb.
James Webb. So we got the web up there, right? So I don't have to remember Spider-Man. I'll get it that way. So you can look at it from afar and see where all maybe those 60 or 50 forms have universal truth, whether it be through the footwork, whether it be through the stance and the postures, the power generation, the way to receive power or redirect power, all those different things are kind of a universal truth that as long as you've got two arms and legs and a pretty good functioning body, those things will be teachable and transmutable. And then maybe if that student gets more into, well, I've done this for a decade on the mechanical side, I want to get into the philosophical side. I want to learn the culture. I want to learn those things. You have those. I want to learn language. What is the meaning of this high rising block? What is the technical terminology? Then you can start to sprinkle in some of that, a little bit more of that, what makes it that Okinawan system, if you will. So
Yeah, totally agree. And I think by studying history, it actually does open perspective more than maybe superficially obvious. And you touched on it, which is sort of like we have to really be sober and aware of the difficulties of transmitting these subtle arts. So if we look
yeah,
at, let's look at it inside the culture. So let's go, a Chinese master to a Chinese student. No language barrier, which is nice, but you're still trying to convey concepts that are not literal. You're trying to express qualities in the body, ways of movement, um, things that you should be feeling, which may or may not show up on an X-ray. So, and of course, there's no X-rays at the time. But so you're trying to convey these interesting, difficult concepts. So you need a very competent teacher and an extremely dedicated student. So that's sort of the baseline. Best case scenario, you have those things. Now let's add on cultural differences. Okay, growing up, someone in Okinawa may have an understanding of how to sit a certain way, whereas in the West, we may not sit that way. For example, in Japan, they have something called seiza, which is sort of like a kneeling position. And when you are Japanese, it becomes very natural and comfortable for your body. But when you try to do it as an American, having never been exposed to a kneeling position like that, it's excruciating if you try to do it for a long bit of time. Tatahiza would be another example of that. So now we've got cultural differences, also philosophical understandings of sort of how we carry the body, what parts of the body and movement we emphasize. Now throw a language barrier onto that as well. So
absolutely.
so now we're trying to express difficult concepts through cultural differences, through a language barrier, and we haven't even gotten to the part of trust yet. So now
Wow. Yeah.
now do
Yeah.
we trust the student? So you're talking about all that, and it has to come through all of these filters, which is why when we study history, it allows us and it gives us the opportunity to pass by some of those gateways that maybe we incurred a barrier, but someone else didn't catch that barrier, right? So, like for example, I don't have a fluency in the Okinawan or the Japanese languages, but I know people that do. So I can benefit from their ability to skip that barrier. I have relationships with certain teachers who have certain insights and knowledges in different parts of these systems that we uh, learn. So the person who has the language expertise may not have access to the kinds of teachers with the depth of understanding.
Yeah.
So I can skip that barrier. So when we look at history, it gives us the ability to skip some of these barriers, and then it also kind of hints at the ability to cross pollinate, cross train a little bit, so that way we can kind of benefit from each other's barrier circumnavigations.
I love that. It's interesting because we talked a lot. We were having coffee conversation here just a little bit ago, and I was mentioning to you that a lot of the Chinese looked at the empty-handed martial arts, maybe not so much of the military, but the empty-handed martial arts is brute. That's what the idiots did. That's what the thugs did. And I look at that, and you see certain people out there were trying to integrate their philosophy, their morals, their ethics to bring it to a higher standard, and maybe show that even the elite can use something from the martial arts. And one thing that is a barrier to me that I'm starting to acknowledge a little bit more, and we have to be careful with this with modern day and in the West, is multiple forms of intelligence. And I find something, we've interviewed like 15 to 17 people so far. And a lot of our practitioners that are high level, like pretty much everybody that's been on our show, if there is a language barrier between them and their instructor who's Chinese, even though there's a language barrier, there is a touch intelligence. And you have to be willing to, let somebody kind of get their hands all over you. But I'm listening to a lot of these guys. It's like, he put me in this position, he put me in this position. He let me feel his body to get a tactile sense of that body knowledge, and to feel that and to see it in action, to see how that is tangibly, and to recreate it on a tactile scale. And I was wondering, have you ever experienced any of that in your Okinawan teaching?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great counterpoint. Not even a counterpoint, but an additional point to what we're discussing here. Because you're right. That tactile sensation does allow us to surpass or bypass some of those barriers. And I think the more that we explore Western science and Western anatomy and medicine and stuff like that, I think we start to see the value of something like that. So the closeness of connection between two people can become very nonverbal. And we have plenty of examples of that. You have the ability of a close couple. They're out at a party or something like that. They can sort of detect when the other person is losing patience, losing comfort, ready to go. And it doesn't necessarily have to be spoken. It's just these little subtleties. And I think the martial arts is a fantastic example of that. And I have encountered those sort of things. Um, there's there is a quality of internal movement that's inherent in some karate systems, and it's one of those things where if you were to just look at it visually over a video or something like that, you may not be able to sort of experience what's really going on there. But if you place a hand, on the diaphragm area, if you place a hand on the small of the back, you're able to feel some of those movements.
Yes.
And they're not even necessarily all gross contractive movements either. So yes, definitely. So there's a little bit of that tactile sense, and then also the receiving of technique. I mean, that's maybe the most raw version of that, right? So we call in the Okinawan sphere we call it Tuidi, which is Tuidi, and it's basically referencing the joint locking and manipulation and off balancing kazushi type of stuff. And until you feel the sort of the directional manipulation, it's really tough to get a hold of, to wrap your sort of head around. And also, one thing that's extremely important in this context is the tension used or the tension not used. So,
yeah, I love
what I mean?
that. I do know what you mean. That's fantastic. Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of when you're feeling a technique done. A lot of times when it's at its most effective is when you're not feeling a lot of tension and body feedback from the person applying the technique to you. The more tension and the more information they're giving to you from their body, the more you have the intuitive ability to resist it. So,
Yeah.
if they're using tension here, okay, intuitively, if I resist this way, okay, I can meet them in the middle. But if it's simply done with weight, and it's like, well, here we are, tough to describe, right? If you're using these qualities of heaviness, you don't have as much to fight against. So if you try to correct, they'll simply recorrect. If you try to correct again, they'll recorrect, right? Because they're kind of always being heavy on top of you. So until you sort of feel that lack of tension in their body, um, it's really, quite impossible to describe. And then I think the real practical thing where rubber meets the road here is, can you do something to instigate tension in their body?
Oh
Because if
yeah. Oh yeah. I love that. Yeah, you betcha. You
Because
betcha.
if you can do that, if you can start getting a read on their tension and their balance point, that's when you can start to manipulate it. So if someone's at a higher level then you don't really have much of an ability to instigate them. They'll be instigating you, and vice versa.
It's funny because something that my Sifu and Wing Chun Sifu Mayor talks about, he's like, the highest level of the Mokjong or the wooden dummy is you're trying to turn the other into the dummy. And
Mm,
so you're trying to stiffen them up into their defense or even their offense. One of my favorite ways to do that is our simple drill of the Pak Sao, which is the slapping hand.
mhm.
And it's not the arm that I'm attacking. I'm actually trying to disrupt your balance, right? Because balance is universal. If I attack your balance, it doesn't matter what style you do. So
Right.
I'm trying to attack their balance, their nervous system,
Mhm.
right? Because it's just a good old palm strike. Your arm just happens to be in the way of your balance. I'm attacking the arm, but again, it's not to hurt the arm, it's to shock the nervous system
Yeah.
and stiffen you up.
Yeah.
And that's when it's so easy to flow and move around you
Mhm.
and to chain those movements together. That's how it happens, is the stiffened up, shocked nervous system that you're talking about, which
Yeah.
again goes back to the universal human quality in the martial arts.
Yeah. Agree.
Here's a weird question that we haven't asked before. You ready for this one?
Okay. I don't know.
How long's it been since you've been in the Chinese martial arts? You said since you were 11. Let's date yourself. 26,
Okinawan,
20.
not Chinese.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
Mhm.
the Okinawan arts.
Mhm.
How have you been involved? So we'll
Since I
date you.
was Oh yeah, since I was 11, and I'm approaching 40th birthday. So uh yeah, I've got about a year and change until I celebrate my old man 30th anniversary in training.
So, what's kept you going all this time?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. Um,
It's a hard one too, you
yeah,
know.
it's because the answer is definitely different things, right?
Mhm.
I suppose that a person could have a singular goal and objective that keeps them north starred their entire life.
Sure,
That's extremely admirable, but I don't think I would qualify myself as that. Um, so
me too.
let me take a minute and try to visualize the different eras. Okay, so starting off at 11 years old, what motivated me was looking cool, winning tournament trophies, getting a black belt, any other superficial stuff we can list here, getting to wear a gi, watching Karate Kid.
Yes.
So basically, all the superficial dumb stuff that you could make fun of. That's what was motivating me when I first started. Uh, let's also talk about weakness in character. Competing against other people, trying to be better than them, trying to be higher rank than them. All those things, absolutely. So, what I think one interesting thing that has happened is when I was younger, I was a very aggressive type of personality,
Hmm.
quick to anger, quick to mouth off, and quick to go directly at a person. And so one very lovely thing is that through the martial arts, I had to at first pretend to not be like that. Because if you're in a dojo and you act like that too much, of course, if you're in a bad dojo, then that'll be encouraged. But eventually, you have to kind of course correct that a little bit and act a little bit more refined, a little bit more polished, a little bit more reserved. And fortunately for me, over time that took hold. So while I pretended to be that at first, eventually it did start to kind of seep in and become part of my actual character. So as that was occurring, those things that motivated me at first started to drift away. They started to feel very shallow, very hollow. Um, that's certainly not to critique anyone who goes to tournaments and it feels a push of motivation.
Sure.
Because sometimes you have to find external things to kick you into gear. So I do not judge that, but over time that sort of stopped becoming a motivation for me. Then I would say something that kept me involved was sharing or deepening my understanding of what I was doing, rather than just sort of doing it routinely over and over again. Um, was there a way for me to deepen it? And this was still a selfish goal, because I wanted to find ways to improve what I was doing, make myself better in terms of technique and skill and practical things. So still selfish, but a little bit more introspective. As time continued to go on, I felt this urge to share. Let me get some of these ideas that are rattling around in my head. By the way, a big factor of that was I had an hour and a half commute to work and an hour and a half back, so a lot of time sitting in silence. Um,
Sure.
so almost meditative. I was like, okay, I'm coming up with a lot of thoughts. Let me get this out. So the nice thing was then my motivation started to evolve into a giving and a sharing. Um, and so I think uh, in retrospect, that was a good thing because it started to help me look outside of myself a little bit and remove some of those selfish goals, and replace them with, okay, now how can I be part of the community at large? How can I provide value to people? How can I be in conversations that are meaningful? Um, and where I find myself at now is a much quieter space, which I'm really enjoying and getting value out of. And when I say quiet, I mean internally quiet. I'm not uh, anxious about improving myself and my skill. I'm not anxious about sharing. I'm just doing these things because they give me a sense of fulfillment, um, and it has allowed me to view myself sort of from the outside looking in, and then from the inside, pushing out. So again, this is another thing that's a little difficult to describe, but I'm at a much quieter place right now, and I am finding a lot of value in that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. That was a great share. That was a great share. Yeah, I think mine too. If you don't mind, I'll share just a little bit with you.
Please do. I'd like to see the similarities of the
The
differences.
similarities and differences. I've said this on a few different podcasts, but I came from a physical culture, not so much a martial one. My first job was for my dad when I was 10, and we were selective cut loggers in the mountains. And at 10 years old, he gave me a little hatchet, and I had a little come along rope, and we were on a hillside, and so I'd delimb the trees. I'd get 3 of them in there, and then I'd drag them to the truck, and I'd load them up on the truck, and I made $10 a day.
Nice.
And so I was used to being outside. I was a kid that played outside. My first job was Pops at 10, outside. Eventually, my hatchet, along 12 or 13, would become ATVs. And then eventually it'd be a chainsaw myself. And those other things. And then my first job not working for Dad was at 15 at a marina. So I was outside on the docks, in the water. One of my favorite jobs has been on the golf course. So something physical, something tactile and tangible with my hands was always a part of my life. I did a couple of years of high school wrestling. I was awful at it, but God, I loved it. And I think I've mentioned this on some other shows too. Growing up in a trailer park with a friend that had gone down to the Front Range once a month, and he would study a little bit of karate and a little bit of taekwondo, and he'd share it with me. I was usually uke.
Sure,
I was usually a good punching bag, but he always, took care of me and showed me some of the stuff too. So I appreciated that. I was fascinated with it. I was 5 when I saw The Karate Kid in the theater, and I can actually tell you're going to love this because you can name what it was. As we know, the late great Fumiya Demura was our main man. That was Miyagi. And it was after Miyagi had just beat up the kids at Hal. From one foot to the other. And at 5 years old, I said to myself, I'm like, I have never seen anybody move like that. Why is he moving like that? And so that question stayed with me. Get to my freshman year at Mesa. I start judo because I missed wrestling. And then the head of the math department was teaching a free Wing Chun class. And I wanted to learn how to kick booty, but I was never really good with my hands. And so Wing Chun allowed me to get good with my hands. And then, over time, that story has changed. I felt very martially capable after about 9 or 10 years of doing Wing Chun, but everything I was doing was linear.
Mm.
I think I'd mentioned this to you over coffee. My weightlifting style was linear. Wing Chun is very linear. And then I had found a career that I liked in the bus driving where I'm sitting under tension all day.
Right.
I didn't really have a method to take care of myself.
Mhm.
And so I went through a bad breakup with a girlfriend, and I had an old friend reach out. He's like, hey, I met a group in Boulder. They're fantastic. I think you should try this Xingyi stuff. I met Owen. I liked his teaching style. And I really wasn't looking to train another martial art, Matthew.
Mhm.
I was looking for a good group of people to be around,
Yeah, I hear you.
almost like a Sangha, if you will. So I
Mhm.
wanted a good group of people to train with. And I really have always believed my whole life that movement can heal and movement
Mhm.
can change.
Mhm.
And so doing the Xingyi forms was so different from the little bit of wide eyebrow I dabbled in, was so different from the Wing Chun that I dabbled in. I'm like, let's restart here.
Mhm.
And so I still practice my Wing Chun, but I wasn't trying to mush stuff together. I
Mhm.
wasn't trying to integrate. I'm like, let's put a shelf for Wing Chun and a shelf for Xingyi. And when I'm doing Xingyi, let's do Xingyi. When I'm doing Wing Chun, let's do Wing Chun.
Yeah,
So
makes sense.
I really threw myself as much as I could into the Xingyi. At the same time, I started finding the light Indian clubs. I went through my old notes and started doing Tai Chi ball again. Actually, I knew the method, but I didn't practice it. And that's one thing to know something, and then there's to know it through wisdom of the
Yeah.
practice. So started doing that, started doing some other dynamic movement patterns. And yeah, I
Yeah.
was like, okay, well, I can kick butt and I can defend myself. But am I somebody worth defending?
Yeah.
Am I who I really want myself to be?
Yeah.
And so that has been the next step in my training process
Yeah.
is, when you have such attention to detail that Bagua and Xingyi takes, you're looking at the movement, but you're also having to look at yourself
Mhm.
on a different perspective. And so that has been what's kept me training and moving forward is, am I getting better in the morals and the principles and all
Yeah.
those other things. So I don't know. Just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, no,
So
definitely. It's always interesting to hear, it's not an easy thing to do for decades. So if you
yeah,
don't have a compass and a motivation, inevitably it's going to fall away to things that are e- easier or more fulfilling, or whatever the case may be. So there has to be something there. Um, and it kind of reminds me of something that one of my instructors, a gentleman named Bill Hayes, from Shobayashiru, one of the things he likes to say is you have to pay attention to both lifespan and health span. And so
yes,
lifespan is literally how long we live, and medical science can keep you going for a long time. Um, and you can live until you're 90, but the last 20 years can be wheelchair or lung issues because of smoking or whatever the case may be. So lifespan is the literal length, but health span is the quality of the life. And so
yes,
these practices that we do, if we continue to evolve with them and we continue to let them evolve with us, it can improve our health span as well. Which is why when you're turning 40, I'm about to turn 40. I think you've crossed that bridge, if I'm not mistaken. But you can correct me if I'm wrong there.
I'll be 45 in September,
Okay,
so I
yeah.
got
So
a
you
few years on it.
you've
Yeah,
crossed the bridge. So the way that you train at 40 or 45 must be different than the way you trained when you were 11 or 17 or what have you.
yes,
Um, but one thing that I don't think is mentioned very much with health span is also mental health span. So
yeah,
we've
yeah,
got the physical. So if you continue to do kata and you're mindful of the body and you utilize tension and relaxation strategically, that can increase your health span. But if you don't have the things that you were describing, which is the philosophical underpinning, the comfort within yourself, um, the way to process emotions. Actually, interestingly, I think hard physical training and hard martial training can be detrimental to emotional wellness if you're not careful. if you put damage on the body and you're impacting the body, and you're creating these compressions, and you're affecting the lymphatic system and the nervous system, and the fascia and things like that, you can create different problems, and stagnations, for lack of a better term, which can cause emotional distress. So
Mhm.
people who are much further along in sort of the development of their, let's call them internal arts, yourself included, but some of the individuals in the Shobayashi-ryu, um, I've heard them tell stories where they were not minding their practice properly, and it actually exacerbated depression symptoms, or
Mhm.
it exacerbated emotional unbalance. So our health span is not just physical wellness, but emotional and mental wellness as well. And so, kind of having conversations like this, or conversations with other people who you respect, and have kind of traveled that path, um, I think that's a key part of the journey as well, not just the physical.
100% agreed. It's fascinating too because I'll give I'll share with my own stuff, and then I'll talk about just a hair about why I really believe that these arts always had the parallel of the Chinese medicine with it. Owen talks a lot about getting deep into the body, into the tissues, and he's like, as you change that, excuse me, the body. There's a beautiful book out there. I can't think of the author. He's a Swedish gentleman. It's a hard book to read. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, in fact, my wife is reading it right now.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Mhm.
And but we do keep a lot of our emotional and physical trauma stored within the body. So when you have a practice like a Bagua or a Xingyi, you're going to get into some of these tissues that have not been moved,
Mhm.
maybe forever. Who
Mhm.
knows?
Yeah.
And you're going to have some of that emotional garbage and damage
Mhm.
come up as it tries to release.
Mhm.
And Owen was talking about this, and I believe it. That because I've almost done it a few times. That a lot of people that get to that point in the internal arts will walk away from it
Mm. Mhm.
because they can't deal with it, because they can't
Mhm.
process with it. And I really think that we live in a time, which I'm very grateful for, that psychiatric
Mm.
work is on a high level, and it's very acceptable for people to talk to therapists. I've had therapy, and I would suggest it to anybody and everybody. I
Yeah.
have a good therapist friend, as a matter of fact, and I liked his way of talking about therapy. He's like, "I'm investing in myself.
Mhm.
It's an emotional bank that
Mhm.
I'm putting money into." So I really appreciated that. But something that happens with the Chinese arts a lot is they have the bruise wine, they have the hip medicine, all the other stuff, but a lot of them are bone setters,
Mhm.
and in the bone setting process, your bones don't have to be out of line, but they also have a massage therapy practice,
Mhm.
and so there comes that tactileness with the system and the other half
Mhm.
of it.
Yeah.
But that's something maybe down the road that I would love to get into. I haven't done that. I've done more
Yeah.
almost like the personal training route with the Indian clubs and the mace and the
Mhm.
kettlebells and stuff. But that tactile release that like we're talking about on the emotional scale, I think really has to be considered in the health practice and the longevity of these practices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it really kind of harkens back to what we were describing about motivation and objectives as well. Because if you don't have a strong sense of your motivation and where you want to go, and what you're achieving with this practice, when you hit those emotional resistance points like you described, it's almost intuitive to turn away from them,
Oh yeah.
because
Oh yeah.
your body's telling you, hey, no more. This is, we feel bad about ourselves. Let's go find something that helps us feel better about ourselves. So if you don't have the tools in place to kind of get through that, and 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 there's some sensei-ship involved here too, right? Like,
Mm,
if you don't have someone further along that's saying to you, hey, you're going to come when you're with this practice, you're going to come up against some rocky road. Just understand that you're digging some of these things up from the body. The brain's trying to understand why the physicality of itself is changing, and why the chemical processes are changing.
Yes. Yep. Oh, did I lose you? There you are. I think we're finding the end of where our technical things are with our phones and everything. There you are.
Am I
Hey,
back?
Matt. Yeah, you are. It's funny
Okay.
because I was just talking to the audience. We're finding the technical ends of the bodies of these of our phone. I see your finger. I hear your voice. I don't think I have you on camera yet, Matthew.
Let me play here.
Finger Matt's fine too.
So what happened there was this is just a little technical
Is your
discovery.
phone overheating?
No, not at all. I had a call come in,
Ah,
and so the finger you're seeing is the cancellation of that call. Um, but I'm trying to figure out how to get me back.
you know what's
Um,
cool? Let's see. I'm gonna flip. There's my underwear. Okay, I'm gonna flip. There you are. So I showed him my underwear. Now Matt's back. Just gotta have the right.
I also I'm not sure which one it was, but I minimized my YouTube and reactivated my YouTube. So one of these things did it.
One of these things is going to go on. It's interesting too because I am hoping and I am praying that our first half of the conversation saved because on this end it's showing 12 minutes, and so I'm wondering if that's just it dots out the hours. That is what I'm thinking. So I'm praying that our first half of the conversation is saved. If not, we'll have to come back and do it again. We'll do it another time if we have to. But I'll tell you, this has been one of my more favorite conversations. It's so funny. I will let the audience in on this little joke. We did meet about 2 hours ago for an hour and a half for some great coffee and a small breakfast at Ozo. I was mentioning that to the audience. We talked for a good hour and a half. And then now we're probably at an hour and a half now, and I feel like I could do this the rest of the day because it's easy. It's almost like speaking of the Olympics that are going on right now. It's like a relay or the baton handoff. You get to hear something really insightful, and you throw in your 2 cents, and other questions come up, and that's one reason for what it's worth. And maybe at some point, Sanren Martial Arts 2 will have maybe a monthly podcast. But these conversations with people that you like, you respect, you think that they're doing something good, usually they've thought about the practice deeper, and they've trained it a little deeper, and we can come up with some of these similarities and also the differences, and still respect the people in those differences, and get hyped for the similarities and finding some similar things. You were talking about the body.
Yeah, no, I agree. And by the way, I see on my end 67 minutes. So hopefully, the fact that it's showing me that means that the technology has retained what we were talking about. But at any rate, yes. So one thing that I also find exciting about a format like this is it allows you to test drive something you've been thinking about. So like, you're working on your stuff, and you're like, well, I've come up with this new little tweak to something I'm doing physically, or I'm thinking about something in a new way. Well, let me just bounce it over to Randall and let me see what the reaction is.
Sure.
Like, is it just is it nothing, or
white screen?
Yeah. And by the way, that's a fault not of Randall, but of the concept. So if I see some, and this is, I think, true for everyone who enjoys this format. It's like, let me bounce the tennis ball over to you, and see if it sticks. And if it does, I'll keep fleshing it out. But if it doesn't, maybe I'll let that one slide.
Fair enough. Oh man, I got to tell you something, and maybe we can wrap it up here in 10 or 15 minutes with this part. So something that Owen and I have been talking about a lot, maybe we need to do a show about it. We've interviewed a lot of people, and we have more in the can, and we're very excited about that. But I have found a missing link in vocabulary between high-level practitioners only and then the high-level practitioner / high-level teacher.
Mm-hmm.
There is a missing thought process. And I will say that how I present the Wing Chun, that's mainly what I try to teach, is the Wing Chun. I feel somewhat competent. I don't have my Sifu's full system, so I never use the title Sifu. I'm his Colorado rep, and I go by the term coach. That's really how I teach, is more on a hands-on coach. But I will say that the way that Sifu Mayer taught me was principle-based. And I've seen an iteration how I was taught at college. I did the doctorate amount of college time, which Ed Hamada, God bless his soul, he was the head of the math department. He taught it a certain way. And then Sifu Mayer would come in once or twice a year, crack our heads open over a weekend, dump 3 or 4 years worth of material in, and then sew our heads back on. And it was us to piecemeal it out to be digestible. And then I started working private lessons with Sifu. I would stay days or as long as I could with them, a week at a time sometimes. And what I didn't realize, and it took me a long time, is how the seminar method of teaching and how the classroom level of teaching, how they were so different. And so when I came to that conclusion, my second degree that I was working on was in education. So I was a big fan of curriculum planning.
Yeah.
And so I've had about 7 iteration, mutation, transmutations, whatever words you want to use, of how I introduce Wing Chun to a rookie student. And I'm just finding now, after almost 26 years coming this October in Wing Chun, I'm just finding now, 26 years later, what I really believe to be good, solid teaching steps and methodology to build off the next rung in the ladder. And the other thing I'm really trying to do is something that Sifu Mayer talked a lot about was Wing Chun's kind of fractal. So if you have the numbers 1 through 10, right? Maybe you have used 1, 5, 7, and 8 for years. That's all you had in 1 through 10. And then all of a sudden the concept of 2, you're like, wait a minute, I just figured out 2. And then when you find 2, well, 3 makes sense. And then you keep going back and back and back. Yeah. And then all of a sudden 10 appears. Yeah. And then eventually down the road, you've got the full 1 through 10s. That's what I want my students to do, is I try to set them up to ask questions for the next step, right? Because I'm like, okay, maybe this hand shape, there's one way. I want to show you one way to use it. Okay? But that's not the only way you can use it. And then later down the road, I show them the same hand shape, but instead of using the back of the arm, we're segmenting and using the wrist. Well, look, it's the same hand shape, but you're isolating part of it. Okay? And then maybe I'm going to use this side of the arm, and I'm going to use it as a pulling action, right? I'm going to use the thumb side. And then maybe I'm going to use the pinky line and use it as a blade side, right? Or maybe the arm is flat, and I use the palm side, and I bring it up. And I use it as a slap or a raising action. So it's the same hand shape, but it's got 5 different qualities to it. But I'm going to start you with 1. That's not the only thing. And I'm going to give you digestible pieces to realize, oh, well, I can use it as a pull. I can use it as a strike. I can use it as a defensive action. I can use it as a raising action. I can use it as a, oh my God hand, save my butt action. Sure. But I'm always trying to give them little bits where they can start asking questions around the material.
Definitely. Brings up 2 thoughts.
Okay.
One is, I think a secret. Let's reveal a secret here.
Okay, let's do it.
Because it's sizzly. I think a secret of a good sensei is that they treat their students like test subjects. So
I do too.
When you, if you're a sensei, by the way, there's no evil in lining up 20 students and having them do things by the book. Everybody looks the same. Everybody's on the same count, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to improve your senseiship, you have to treat each individual like a test subject. See how they respond to the stimulus. See what interesting questions that they bring up or resistances that they bring up, and adapt your educational skill set to each of those test subjects. So you teach kata to a person this way, and then you teach them a 2-person drill that's related to this kata. Yes. Then another student, you teach them a practical application, and then you show them the kata afterward. What was the absorption rate between those 2 people? Was it wiser to teach them the form first and then extract from it? Or was it wiser to teach the extraction and then show them the form?
Oh, there we are.
You're back. Okay, cool.
We're back.
So what I was saying was, there's an example of ways that you can teach people in different orthodoxies, different methodologies, and then sort of see that response and let it inform and educate you, basically your ability to be an instructor. So I think one of the big secrets is like when you're a student and you come into a dojo, I think you always assume that like this teacher's been doing it forever. They know exactly what they're going to show me. They know exactly what to do next. When in actuality, if that sensei is quite good, they're tweaking and testing and trying to figure things out as they go. That's what keeps them engaged with senseiship, and what kind of keeps them growing as a teacher as well. So it kind of harks back to our conversation about motivation and keeping sort of a north star as you're growing. We never, I don't know if we explicitly touched upon teaching as a part of that, but I think it certainly can be. So that's kind of one thing that I took away from what you were describing. And then the other thing, which is you were talking about the 1 through 10, and if you have that, or maybe you're shown to eventually, and then you can find three. Um, I have found I've heard it described in this way, and this is another thing that I'm going to steal from Bill Hayes Sensei. And some people will know what I'm getting at, but I'll carry it to the punchline anyway. So you've got a giant box, right? And this oversized box has a hole poked in it, and you take a peek in that hole, and you see this little gray mass. It kind of looks like this, but it's gray. And then, okay, another hole gets poked in it from over here, but it's kind of like up high. You take a peek in there, and there's this sort of gray flappy thing that kind of does this. Okay. You get a third hole poked in it, and then there's like this little dangling thing like this, also gray. This is not an illicit story. So
I was hoping.
Eventually, you poke enough holes from enough different angles, and you realize you've got an elephant inside the box.
Yep.
And what you can do is, at a certain point, depending on your competency, depending on how many holes you get poked for you, the speed at which you understand that there's an elephant in there can vary. It can take a day, it can take 20 years, depending on the speed at which you get that information.
Yep.
But at a certain point, you have to start intuiting what the rest of it is, without having someone to lift the whole box for you. So the 1 through 10 kind of reminded me of that, where it's like, if you have a savant, you may get that first hole poked, and they can intuit the complete rest of the elephant. Okay, wonderful. Yeah. This is what we call, an inventor or an innovator, someone who can shift a paradigm. Most of us are not that, and that's totally fine. But then your core competency, the quality of your instructor, that can dictate the amount of different holes that you're going to require.
Yes.
But it's the pursuit of continuing to find those holes, so that way you get to the core of it.
I love it. And it's so fascinating too, because I think at some point you start to, once you get the hole, you can look at that picture in perspective from different angles. Mm-hmm. Are you looking at the whole elephant on the front? Are you looking at it on the side? Are you looking at it from on top? Are you looking at it off the bottom? And then you get that 3-dimensional, little and moving image, if you will. And that's where it really becomes special, because I teach my students, but I also train what I teach them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's always fascinating. And that's where we have somebody further down the road, right? When they come to me like, okay, I am not getting this. Okay, try it this way, try it this way, try it this way. And I think that's so much fun. I like, and I love to see somebody have what we call the aha moment, right? Where it's like, wow, I totally get that. And that's crazy. One of the things that I loved from my Qigong, who's my teacher's teacher, Wang Qiu, used to say that some of Wing Chun has to be taught, and the other half has to be caught. And that's a little bit of what we're talking about. Is nice, in the training process, you have to be intuitive enough to figure out those things. And I find a lot, I think something in the West, and again, this isn't universal. We've been told that you never ask, you never question sensei, you never ask Sifu, you never question them. And all of the great people that I've heard and see training and teaching out there, like, I had to ask my teacher questions. I had to ask my teacher questions. Mm-hmm. My teacher's like, are you doing this right? How's this going? They actually want questions to see if the learning process, if it's getting through, is it sticking? And so I find that to be a fascinating thing too.
Absolutely. I think if we could sort of like instill one quality into every student the day that they walk into the door, it's an enthusiasm for asking questions.
Yes.
Because that's going to be a huge different maker of whether you're just coming in and doing a workout or whether you're going to excel and find ways to deepen your understanding. And every student has to come to an understanding of what their sensei is like. Is there a specific time and place for questions? Are they open all the time? You just got to kind of have to figure that out on a case by case basis.
Mhm.
But that enthusiasm and that willingness to ask questions, yeah, probably one of the biggest qualities you can have in a student or anyone at any level, really.
For me, and I want to say I'm kind of I'm dabbling on 20 years of teaching. For me, the biggest thing or hurdle I have to make sure of is, are they practicing? Because if they're practicing and I can see it, and I know that they're practicing when they're not working with me, then I'm going to be hip to show it in a bunch of different ways.
Mhm.
But if you're coming now, and it's taken a while for me to be this way, now if you're coming to me with questions and you're not practicing, I try not to use it too much, but I'm like, well, you need to practice more because as I mentioned to you at coffee, we are consciously training the subconscious.
Mhm.
And if some of these qualities that I want you to express are not in your nervous system yet, then everything else is going to be knowledge based and not wisdom based. I
Makes
need it to
sense.
be
Yeah.
in your body before we can take the next step and along the next road. Well,
I
my
agree.
friend, I could talk to you all day, but let's see how much, because we went in and out 2 or 3 different times.
Mhm.
So we are going to see how much of this actually saved, and knock on wood, it's a one solid piece, and we'll figure it out from there. But just in case, Matthew, where can people find you?
Well, I think the best places to locate what I'm up to. The blog is Ikigai Way or Sanrin Arts. So here we go, right? A little easier to remember how to spell Sanrin Arts. SANRINARTS.com. Um, yeah, I think that would probably be the best place to go to keep an eye. When I'm publishing books and stuff like that, there'll always be a blog post um, there related to that. So let's go there.
Okay, quick wrap up. This might be a year or two out of the way, but what are you thinking about as far as your teaching process goes? Anything on the horizon there?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So I've started integrating some digital instruction, which has been a really interesting new step because one thing that you and I touched upon here is the need for tactile response. So I'm having to integrate in-person visits with the individuals that I'm teaching online. And so I'm trying to dial in that balance. Like, how much can you go digital before you need to get back and do the touch again?
Yep.
Versus, what's that formula look like? So working on that kind of thing, some seminar type stuff. But yeah, that's where I'm at with that. Very much enjoying this phase of getting myself into regular teaching and having moved from Pennsylvania to Colorado back and forth. It has been a real challenge to keep a physical location. So I'm not doing the digital teaching just out of pure, love of tech. It's more just a practical need for me based on my mobility. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Thank you for your time today, my friend. Great having coffee with you. I look forward to talking to you more in person and down the road, my friend. We'll pick on you
Likewise.
soon, Matthew. Have a
Thank you
blessed
for
one,
having me.
brother.
Cheers.